The following program was made possible by the friends and partners of FBC Taft Media Ministry. Coming up on the FBC Taft Media Ministry worship service.
A few years ago, I got to do this really cool thing. I got to hike the Grand Canyon. We started at the north rim of the Grand Canyon. We hiked down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and then we hiked out of the Grand Canyon at the south rim. Me and a friend of mine did this, and we did it in a really short time period. We started in one morning. We hiked all day into the night. We slept for a few hours on some thermarest camping pads, and then we hiked out the next day. So in about 36 hours, we hiked completely down into the Grand Canyon and then hiked out of it. It was an amazing experience. I had been in the Grand Canyon before and stood kind of at the edge and looked over and thought, wow, that's really big. It's a whole different thing when you are traversing the trails and you get down into the canyon walls and you look up and you realize just how massive this is as you're crossing the bridge over the river, and you just realize this is an incredibly beautiful sight. But before we go any further, if you volunteered at BBS this week, if you were one of the adults, doesn't matter if you were with kiddos, if you were doing music, if you were handing out snacks, but if you were a volunteer this week at BBS, would you stand really quickly? Because we have all of our volunteers stand who are here today. Way to go. Good job. Give them a high five right around. Give them a high five. None of y'all gave high fives. There you go. A few high fives. Fantastic. Way to go, adults. That is amazing. And as Pastor Scott said, that is, it's truly a great service to the future of the local church to be able to tell students and kids and everybody about the wonderful hope that is found in Jesus Christ. It is an amazing thing. It is a great privilege for me to be here today. My name is Chris, and I work out at Stark College and Seminary in Corpus Christi, where we get to train pastors and church leaders and all sorts of people who serve in the local church. And so to be a part of a service today that is a gathering not just of one local church, but is a collection, a community effort, this really is a privilege and an honor. And I'm so proud of this collection of churches here in Taft, Texas, that you are doing this amazing work together, that you are glorifying the Lord Jesus Christ, that you are celebrating together, you're worshiping together. That is an amazing thing. Sometimes as churches, we can think only about what separates us and what keeps us distinct and unique as congregations, and it is good for us to remember that above all of those things, there's one thing that we have in common, and that is our devotion to Jesus Christ. And so it is an amazing thing to be here with you today. And we are going to talk about Matthew chapter 23, two short verses in Matthew 23. And at first they're going to look super negative, but I promise there is a promise on the backside of this, a reminder that Jesus is offering. But we're going to look at a warning that Jesus gives to this group of people, the Pharisees, in Matthew chapter 23. So I'm going to read these verses 23 and 24 in Matthew 23. Matthew 23, 23, and 24. Jesus says this, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and have neglected the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. These you ought to have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides, straining out a gnat and swallowing a camel." Church, would you pray with me? God, we open our hearts to receive a message from you today. God, we know that our lives aren't always in step with where you want us to be. And so we begin by confessing the sin that's in our life. God, we begin with repentance. God, we open up to the possibility that you are calling us to follow you better, to know you deeper. God, to grow in relationship with you. And so God, we are prepared to hear from you this morning. And it's in Jesus' name that we pray. Amen. A few years ago, I got to do this really cool thing. I got to hike the Grand Canyon. We started at the north rim of the Grand Canyon, we hiked down to the bottom of the Grand Canyon, and then we hiked out of the Grand Canyon at the south rim. Me and a friend of mine did this, and we did it in a really short time period. We started in one morning, we hiked all day into the night. We slept for a few hours on some Thermarest camping pads, and then we hiked out the next day. So in about 36 hours, we hiked completely down into the Grand Canyon and then hiked out of it. It was an amazing experience. I had been to the Grand Canyon before and stood kind of at the edge and looked over and thought, wow, that's really big. It's a whole different thing when you are traversing the trails and you get down into the canyon walls and you look up and you realize just how massive this is as you're crossing the bridge over the river, and you just realize this is an incredibly beautiful sight. But one moment, as we were hiking in the evening, and it had become dark, and there's no street lights out there, so it was really dark, and we're hiking by headlamp, and I'm pretty tired because we've been hiking all day, and I am just kind of watching the trail in front of me. And I remember thinking, you know what, I'm going to look up around and like notice the stars and that sort of thing, but I was kind of focused on what was right in front of me the whole time. When all of a sudden, through my little headlamp light circle, all of a sudden scampers across this huge black scorpion. Massive thing. I don't know about you, I'm not a big scorpion fan. I don't love them. They're not my favorite animals in the world, and certainly not out in the middle of nowhere. And I do what probably any of us in here would do, is I shriek like a little girl and I begin to back up immediately, right? Because there's a scorpion and I don't want that thing attacking me. And I catch myself because I realize I should have followed it with the light, right? Because now there's a scorpion. I've had confirmation. I just have no idea where it is. And so I am assuming it's on my backpack or it's on me. It's in my hat. I don't know where it is anymore. And I'm looking around. There's no light. And I know that there's a scorpion, at least one, but I assume they have friends, right? Like he's got a whole army. Like if this was just the scout, like, no, he's right here, guys. I found him. Come on. Like, I don't know where he's at that moment. And let me say, if I wasn't looking at the stars before, I certainly wasn't now. Every ounce of focus I had was focused right in front of me, constantly scanning to see when the scorpion horde was going to attack me, right? I was going to be ready for it. Never punched a scorpion, but I was ready in that moment. I was so focused on what was right in front of me. And I told people about hiking the Grand Canyon, and they're like, oh, wasn't it amazing? Wasn't it beautiful? And I said, sure. And they said at nighttime, wasn't it incredible because there's no lights, you could just see so many stars. And I was like, yeah, I didn't pay any attention to that. I was so focused on this scorpion right in front of me, I didn't care. You could have told me that there were like a million shooting stars above me. It didn't matter because there was a scorpion in front of me that I had to watch out for. I had become so focused on this thing right here that I had missed out on all of this that was happening above me. And let me say, church, I think that's what Jesus is tapping into here for all of us. Not just the scribes and the Pharisees. Certainly we're going to see them and why Jesus is talking to them in just a moment. But for all of us, we face this great temptation that sometimes we can be so focused on one specific thing that we can actually miss out on some bigger blessings, some bigger callings that God has for our life. And so that's what is in my mind today. Now, specifically, Jesus is talking to the scribes and Pharisees about this really common ancient practice with the church. But it's not always so common to people outside of the church. When I was on church staff a few years ago, our church actually was sued, and this insurance suit, it was kind of a complicated thing. But this fancy lawyer from Dallas came down and was questioning and deposing our pastor and going through all these things. And he kept coming back and talking about this thing, the tithe. My pastor didn't know what he was talking about. And he'd come back and say, yeah, but tell me about the tithe. I don't know what you're talking about. And it was just this common thing, like in the conversation where the lawyer constantly was asking him about the tithe. And finally, the pastor realized, oh, you're talking about the tithe. I get it. Like, yeah, it's not the tithe. It's the tithe. It's this common thing. Because in church world, this idea of tithing, even if we aren't always like regular practitioners, we kind of know that that's baked into what's going on in church. And while today's message isn't about tithing specifically, perhaps it might demystify some of the idea of tithing, because that's what Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and the scribes about, is this practice of tithing. Now, where does it come from? I'm going to read a number of Old Testament scriptures to you today, but I promise I'll summarize them, we'll recap them. This idea of tithing comes from Deuteronomy chapter 14, and you do not have to turn there, but this is this command that Moses is delivering to the people. He tells them, "You shall tithe all the yield of your seed that comes from the field year by year. And before the Lord your God, in the place that he will choose to make his name dwell there, you shall eat the tithe of your grain, of your wine, and of your oil, and the firstborn of your herd and flock, that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always." The idea of tithing, that is taking some of what I have received and then giving it back to the Lord, is baked into the very fabric of the people of Israel. When they are returning, leaving Egypt, going to their new promised land, it is one of the initial ideas that is going to set them apart and be distinct. You're going to take some of what you have produced each year, and then you are going to give it back to the Lord. And there are some really specific ideas of why people would tithe. You ever wondered that? Why do we tithe? Like, what's the reason for tithing? Let me tell you, there's two big reasons for tithing. And tithing first had a function to it. It was, in a sense, a form of taxation, but not just taxation. It actually provided for the priests. There was this whole group of people in Israel called the Levites. And the Levites were the ones who tended to the spiritual care of Israel. And they didn't have land. In fact, every tribe in Israel had their own land, and people could own land, except for the Levites. The Levites were distributed throughout the whole land to function as priests. They didn't have land, which meant that they weren't going to be able to produce food. They didn't have income. And the tithe was one of the ways that you would provide for the Levites. It says in the book of Numbers, "To the Levites, I have given every tithe in Israel for an inheritance in return for the service that they do." So the Levites, their inheritance was the tithe. People would bring their tithe, and that was then given to the Levites. There was a function to the tithe. In Deuteronomy, it says that you may eat within your towns, or the tithe of your grain. It goes on to say, "But you will eat them before the Lord your God in the place that the Lord your God will choose. You and your son and your daughter, your male servant, your female servant, and the Levite who is within your towns." The Lord says, take care that you do not neglect the Levite as long as you live in your land. You see, the tithe had this idea of you were going to take some of what you grew each year, some of what your herd produced. You were going to take some of that and you were going to offer it to the Lord. And then guess what? You get to enjoy it. You get to eat it before the Lord your God. But make sure that you set aside some for the Levites. Because the priests, these people who are attending to your spiritual care, they're not going to be able to produce a crop. They're not going to be able to raise herds. And so you want to make sure that you are taking care of them. That's what the tithe did. It was a way to bring everyone together, to remember the Levites. But even bigger than that, it wasn't just for the Levites. It says in Deuteronomy 14 that at the end of every 3 years, you shall bring out all the tithe of your produce in the same year and lay it up within your towns. And the Levite, because he has no portion or inheritance with you, and the sojourner, the fatherless, the widow who are within your towns, they shall come and eat and be filled, that the Lord your God may bless you in all the work of the hands that you do. So the tithe was this way of saying, well, we want to take care of the Levites because they don't have any land, they don't have any way to grow crops, and so we want to make sure that we take care of them. But the tithe had an even bigger function, because there were these other people who existed kind of at the edge of society. There were widows and the sojourners, there were the fatherless, those that were orphans, those people that didn't have somebody looking out for them. And God sets up His society so that there would be a way that even those people who didn't have any provisions would still be provided for. And the way that they would do that is that the community, in their generosity, when they brought out their tithe, would make sure that even those people at the edge of society were still cared for. I mean, that's a pretty incredible thing. You see, the tithe had this very functional purpose to it. But it didn't just serve as a function, it also had a deeper lesson. Deuteronomy 14 says that they will do all of this with the tithe, so that you may learn to fear the Lord your God always. Now that doesn't just mean fear as in being scared, it means fear as in revere, to have a proper respect for who God is. You see, there is a lesson that comes from the tithe, and it's to remember all that God has provided for us. I saw somebody on Facebook recently describe parenting as having a broke friend who thinks you're rich. Like, parenting is having a broke friend who thinks you're rich. If you have kids, you may experience that sometimes, right? My kids, they constantly come to me for money. They constantly just think I have all the money in the world. They're like a broke friend who thinks that I am rich. And there are some moments where I bristle just a little bit, because we'll be like at the mall and they will ask me if they can have some money, and I'll ask them what for, and they'll tell me it's for this thing, shoes or a new dress for my daughter, or whatever. Like, they just have this thing that they want, and I'll say, you only need 20 bucks? I know that costs more than that. And they say, well, yeah, but I've been saving, and they say this word, my money. I've been saving my money, and I look at them and I'm like, oh, it takes a lot of restraint as a parent, right? Because what do you want to say? Your money? Where do you think your money comes from, right? Like, your money. Oh, like, it's just laughable. Where do you think you don't have a job? You're not doing anything. Your money. Are you kidding me? Where do you think your money? That's my money. I gave you that money. The idea of the tithe is because sometimes all of us are a little bit like that child when it comes to how God has provided, right? I mean, like, I have to repent of this, because there are moments when I start to think, why would I be generous with all like that I have? Because I've worked hard for it, right? Like, this is my money, this is my house, this is my food, these are my things. And I can't help but think that God is looking down like, your things? Like, where did you get the ability to go to work? Like, Chris, where did you get that ability? God, I think you gave it to me. Like, Chris, where did you get, like, the provision in your life that led you to, God, you gave that to me. For the people in Jesus' time and in the Old Testament time, I think God was probably looking down like, how do you think that the seed actually grew into that plant? Did you do that? Well, no, see, I just planted it in the dirt, but I can't explain how it happened. And God's like, yeah, because I did that. Like, who do you think keeps the hearts of all of your cows beating? Do you do that, farmer? No, you do that, God. You see, the tithe was not only a functional thing, but it had this deeper lesson to it, to remind us that everything is a gift from God. That when we give back to God, we are reminding ourselves, oh yeah, none of this started with me. None of this began with me. God, you are the giver of all good things. And so, of course, I am going to give something back to you. There is a function to the tithe, but there is also a lesson to it. And the lesson is that we would learn to revere, to fear, to respect, to honor God in all that we do. Now, fast forward from those Old Testament times to Jesus' day, and you've got this group of people, the scribes and the Pharisees. And the scribes and the Pharisees have gone overboard with this idea of the tithe, and for good reason. Now, quick history of the people of Israel. What happened is they had their own land. They make good choices, they make bad choices, they make good choices, they make bad choices. Eventually, they make so many bad choices. They've gone so far off track from where God wanted them to be that He sends in people who invade the land, and they send them out of the land. They destroy the temple. The people are taken into exile. But after a few years, they are allowed to return. And they rebuild a temple, but the temple is never as grand as it was during the time of Solomon. And people even weep who had seen the original temple and say, this just doesn't even compare. But they have their land back. They've got a temple. It's like they're given a second chance to make things right. And you have this group of people that look back on their history and say, you know what? If the reason that we were sent out, that we were exiled, that the temple was destroyed, was because we had dishonored God, then it means we are going to have to double our efforts. We're going to have to do better than we ever have before. We are going to have to try harder to follow God, which means not only are we going to do the law that He's given us, we're even going to go a step further. So if the law says we should do this, well, then we don't even want to do anything close to that, because we don't want to even come into the possibility, the zip code, the neighborhood of breaking God's law, we want to make sure we are so far from that that we will never break God's law, that we will never lose our land again. And so they begin to take the law and they start to add to it. Well, you know, if you can't do this in the law, then we want to make sure we're not allowed to do this thing over here. They begin to be over scrupulous. They start to be so detailed that the law itself is no longer their focus. They are now focused on all of these additional rules. And the initial command in this moment is to what? Tithe. It's to bring forth some of your crop. It's to bring forth some of your herd, so that way you could share it, you could eat it, and you could enjoy it. But we know from Jesus' warning that the Pharisees, not only have they done that, but they have been so detailed that they are even counting out their spices. Jesus said, "Woe to you, Pharisees, because you are tithing even your mint and your dill and your cumin." It's like they have taken even the smallest, most detailed, most granular and specific things, and they have even started to tithe on that. Jesus says, you guys are focusing on such small things, but, he says in verse 23, you have neglected the weightier matters of the law. The weightier matters of the law. And I love that word that he uses there, the weightier. Because he's talking about how, like, you're weighing out these small things. I mean, how much does a leaf from a mint plant weigh out, right? Like, I mean, you could put 100 mint leaves in your hand and they don't weigh anything. Same thing with dill or with cumin. You could put that in your hand and it doesn't weigh anything. And Jesus is saying, you're focusing on these small things, but you have missed out on some weighty, some important matters of the law. It's like you're focused on this one thing and you're not paying attention to these weightier matters. Things like justice. Over and over throughout the Old Testament, we see the Old Testament talk about justice. This idea that we should be about setting the world as it should be, making things right, that there is going to be injustice when things feel broken, and we ought to be agents of justice. It says in Exodus that we shouldn't deny justice to poor people. That in Proverbs, that we shouldn't be partial to the wicked or deprive the innocent of justice. That throughout the Old Testament, there's this idea that the people of God are the ones who are trying to restore the world, to bring it back into order, that we are people of justice. Same thing with mercy. Deuteronomy 13 says that none of these condemned things should be found in your hands, so that the Lord will turn from his fierce anger and he will show you mercy and have compassion on you. Well, there's this reminder that God has shown mercy on us. That even though we were deserving of punishment from God, he has not given it to us. He has shown mercy and had compassion. And so in the same way in Hosea, God says, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. Just as God has shown mercy to us, we ought to be merciful to other people. And same thing with faithfulness. Faithfulness is this idea of trustworthiness, that we ought to trust who God is. That we ought to have faith in him, in the promise that he's given us. Justice, mercy, and faithfulness. The woe that Jesus says in this moment is that you have become so focused on these small little things, weighing out your mint, weighing out your dill, weighing out your cumin, that you have missed these big, weighty things. You've focused on the small, but you've missed out on justice. You've made sure to get all of the leaves of your dill, but you haven't paid attention to mercy and faithfulness. See, the problem with the scribes and the Pharisees is that their own individual personal morality had become their focus, and they had missed out on these much bigger ideas. What does Jesus say? Not that you shouldn't have tithed the mint and the dill and the cumin. No, he says you should have done those, but you should have made sure to focus on the weightier matters. He's not saying that it's bad to focus on individual personal morality, what I tithe, what I do, my individual choices. Jesus is not saying those are wrong, but he's saying when you focus on those and neglect these other things, you are missing out. Because you see, justice is not a personal thing. I can't just be just for myself. Justice has to do with how I interact in the community. Mercy has to do with my interactions with other people. It has to do with how I forgive one another, how I love one another, and how I demonstrate grace to one another. You see, there are some community ideas. And the scribes and the Pharisees had said, no, we are going to focus on these things right here. And they had neglected the larger community issues. It's like me with that scorpion. Sure, there were beautiful stars up above, but I was so focused on my own individual steps that I missed it. Jesus is telling them, scribes, Pharisees, guys, you're missing it. You're missing it. You are so focused on these small things that you're not paying attention to the larger matters of the law. And he goes on in verse 24 and calls them, you blind guides. Jesus is just so subtle, right? I mean, just tell the Pharisees what you think of them, man. Like, quit hinting around it. No, you blind guides. He's just so confrontational with them. You blind guides, you strain out a gnat, but you swallow a camel. You strain out a gnat and swallow a camel. Well, again, this idea goes back to some Old Testament ideas. In Deuteronomy chapter 14, verse 19, the law says that all winged insects are unclean for you. They shall not be eaten. Anybody have that like temptation every now and again just to eat a fly? If you don't, that's good because you shouldn't. They're unclean. Don't eat the winged insects, right? But the deal is, it's not just the winged insects themselves. If they were to fall on something or into something, there are some ramifications. In Leviticus, it says this, anything on which any of them falls when they are dead shall be unclean. Like my house in the summertime when the door gets left open and flies are constantly landing. Like my whole house is unclean, it seems like. Anything on which they fall shall be unclean. Listen to what you have to do if a fly, one of these winged insects, falls on something. It says that if any of them falls into any earthenware vessel, all that is in it shall be unclean, and you shall break it. Man, that's going to ruin the next picnic, right, or barbecue. Like if a fly lands on anything in that crock pot, not only is all the food unclean, you're going to have to break the crock pot. That's terrible. That's what it says. If it falls into any earthenware vessel, all that is in it shall be unclean, and you shall break it. Any food in it that could be eaten, on which water comes, shall be unclean. And all the drink that could be drunk from every such vessel shall be unclean. You see, if a fly was to fall into your food, the whole pot is ruined. If a fly is to fall into your drink, not only is the drink itself ruined, but you've got to then break the glass. Like you cannot have this happening. And so the Pharisees, again, in their over-scrupulous nature, decide we've got to make sure that that never happens. And so they are very careful to strain out even the smallest winged insect, the gnat. They create these lids and these covers. It's not like they had Tupperware, right? Like they have their cups, and so they have to cover them with things. They've got to create screens. They've got to make sure that we are not going to lose any of our drink and any of our cups. Jesus says, you are so detailed that you will strain out a gnat. But then he says, but you swallow a camel. Again, in Leviticus chapter 11, the Lord says to Moses, speak to the people of Israel, saying, these are the living things that you may eat among all the animals of the earth. Whatever parts the hoof and is cloven-footed, and chews the cud among the animals you may eat. Nevertheless, among those that chew the cud or part the hoof, you shall not eat these. The camel, because it chews the cud but does not part the hoof. Deuteronomy 14, every animal that parts the hoof and has the hoof cloven in two and chews the cud among the animals you may eat, yet of those that chew the cud or have the hoof cloven, you shall not eat these. The camel, the hare, the rock badger, because they chew the cud but do not part the hoof, are unclean for you. Don't eat camels, it says in the Old Testament. Again, not a great temptation here in South Texas, right? It's not like, what kind of burger you want? You want the cow, you want turkey burger, camel burger? But no, like it's not a big deal. We don't have to face that. Same with the rock badger. Never had rock badger, don't intend to eat that. But in their day, to follow the law, to be detailed to the law, they knew camels off limits. We don't eat camels. And Jesus says to them, he says, guys, you are straining out this small thing, the gnat. But in the process of being so focused on the gnat, you want to know what you're doing? You're swallowing the largest animal that they could conceive of. By straining out this gnat, you guys are swallowing a camel. Guys, you're straining out this one, but you're swallowing the other. Do you see what Jesus is telling? Guys, you just missed it. You missed out on what's going on. You focus on these small, tiny details, and you're missing the much bigger picture. Jesus is saying, guys, there's a way that you can be so focused on your own personal spirituality that you are actually led to be unclean. That you can be so focused on your own personal spiritual practices that you are actually drifting farther and farther away from God. It's kind of an amazing thing, isn't it? That you can actually be so focused on personal, individual, spiritual practices and yet at the same time be moving yourself further and further away from God. Your diligence can actually lead you to be unclean. Woe to you! You tie these things, but you're neglecting the weightier matters of the law. You strain out a gnat, guys, but you swallow a camel. It's a fascinating thought for me. Because let me tell you, I grew up as the quintessential church kid. I went to every VBS you could go to, right? I loved it. My grandmother would play piano at country churches, and so not only did I go to my home church's VBS, I went with her to VBSs. I grew up in church. I read my Bible. I told some of y'all a few weeks ago a story about Bible drill. I knew these things. I knew what it meant to do these personal spiritual practices. And when I hear Jesus' warning, I am convicted. Because there are times when I can become so focused on my own personal spiritual walk that I am blind to everyone else around me. That I can become so dedicated to doing this one discipline, and yet it doesn't penetrate my heart and make me more merciful towards others, more graceful towards others. And I need Jesus to come alongside and remind me, woe to you, Chris, because you are so focused on the one and you're missing out on the other. What is it that God requires of us? He tells us a couple of times. In Micah 6:8, He has told you, O man, what is good, and what does the Lord require of you? But to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with your God. That's a pretty good idea. What should we be about as the people of God? Well, we ought to be about setting the world right, looking for times when it's unjust and trying to make it as God created it to be. We ought to be people of justice. We ought to be people who are merciful and kind to others, and we ought to be people who are walking humbly. That is, we're learning to follow God better day after day. Jesus sums it up in Matthew 22. He says, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your mind. That this is the great and first commandment, and a second is like it. You shall love the neighbor as your neighbor as yourself. Love God and love others. That yes, I ought to be about reading His Word and praying and doing all of those things. Absolutely, that's the first and greatest commandment. But those things ought to lead me to be more loving to other people who I meet. In 1 John says, this is His commandment, that we believe in the name of His Son, Jesus Christ, and that we love one another. That we ought to practice faith, but it ought to lead to love for one another. Jesus says we shouldn't neglect our own personal spiritual practices, our own personal morality, but He also reminds us that that's not the end of the story. The story is when we have become just, when we have become merciful, when we are practicing God's faithfulness everywhere we go. And that happens as we learn to love God. As we learn to love God, we ought to become more loving towards others. And as we love others, we're reminded of our love for God, which then leads us to be more loving for others. Do you see how that cycle works? Church, for me, sometimes I can become myopic. I can become focused on just my own personal spiritual practices, and I need Jesus to remind me, it's not the end. I need to love others as well. Church, would you pray with me? God, we are thankful to celebrate the great work that you did this week through Vacation Bible School. God, those reminders over and over again that when life is unfair, God, that when life is sad, that you are still good. God, may we always keep your goodness in front of us. And God, may we be ready to tell other people about our love for you. God, why you are good, even when circumstances may not look so good. God, may we always carry that message with us wherever we go. But God, may we also remember that you have called us to the community. You have called us to the world around us to demonstrate your love in tangible, practical ways. And so we pray for the work tonight of going out into the park, that this may be a tangible way that somebody else understands your love for them. God, maybe somebody who has never quite been able to connect the dots on why the great, all-powerful God would choose to love them. God, maybe that will become clear tonight. God, may it become clear as we are loving and merciful to everyone that we meet. And it's in your Son Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Thank you for watching the FBC Taft Media Ministry Worship Service. For more information, call us at 361-528-2131 or visit us online at taftmethodist.com. The address is 302 McIntyre Avenue, Taft, Texas 78390. And as always, don't forget to subscribe to the official Media Ministry YouTube channel. Thank you for watching, and God bless you. The preceding program was made possible by the friends and partners of FBC Taft Media Ministry.